All right. Welcome, everybody. Nice to see you. Thanks for joining me and my colleague Gabby to talk about objective setting, an important topic. We'll sort of just, I'll say, loiter for a minute as people are jumping in. I'm looking at my screen and seeing the attendee list growing as people grab their sandwiches or they get out of their meetings or what have you. So thanks very much for being with us. It's always a delight to see you. I'm looking at our participant list. Hey, Gabby, is the chat enabled? I want
I
to
was
make
just going through all of
I
yeah.
remember last time I had people were chatting and I was like, nobody's chatting. So the chat's enabled if you want to say a quick hello, where you're coming from. And if you have any questions along the way, I may not answer them immediately, but we will do our best at some point to try to answer you. So it's nice to see everyone jumping in here. So thanks for sharing your morning, afternoon, evening with us, wherever you are. I'm going to share my screen in a minute. I think what we'll do is I'll pop up my slides and then we'll start the discussion and really just give you a little bit of an overview or a recap of what we talked about last time. Last time was when we started talking about vision, excuse me, and the importance of setting a strong vision in terms of where you're going on your team. And I'll set the premises around teamwork and all that stuff. People seem to like it. So it's good. Gabby, anything from you before we jump in?
I am going to just make sure that the chat settings are what they should be. So please bear with me. I see Ed has said hello to all of you, and you can't say hello back.
That was by design. No, I'm just kidding. No,
Let
we want
me,
to say hello.
here we go. You should be able to, starting now, chat.
Where are people calling in from? Where's your location? Let's get a sense of where people are calling in from. Don't say my desk or my
There
office.
we are.
No, all right, there we go. Richmond, San Diego, Katie, I'll be leaving for San Diego today. Like after this webinar, I'm getting on. My son's graduating from San Diego State tomorrow morning.
Oh, I see a
Belgium,
Belgium. That's
Daniel,
cool.
Bill from Providence. It's like a talk show. Bill from Providence, you're on. Did someone up in Portugal, Canada? Wow. Houston, two from Houston, you probably Hanover, yep, by Dartmouth, Warwick, Humble, Texas. Very nice, Dighton. Lovely to see everybody. So, thanks for joining us. Let me go ahead and get rolling here, and we will talk about setting focus objectives. I'll give you a little overview. I think most people know me. I didn't put my me slide in, but I'm happy to explain that if you don't know who I am. I'm not sure my kids know who I am still. They don't see them very much, but I'm Ed Barrows. I'm a professor of the practice of leadership here at Brown at the School of Professional Studies. I'm also the academic director for our online asynchronous Master of Organizational Leadership. And my colleague Gabby is joining us today. She is one of our many marketing mavens that keeps things running and communicating. See, she's smiling. that keeps us on track to bring these wonderful events to you. We've had a raft of these events. So I encourage you to come to all the different events we have. And more importantly, I encourage you to go back and look at the recordings of all the events that we had in the past. There's all kind of good things there for you. So we're in the midst of our welcome. We will jump into lessons in leadership, which I'll tell you a little about just the program overall and orient you real quickly, and then we'll get into 12 skills and the logic on the 12 skills framework. If you haven't heard it, this is my colleague Laura Downing's and my second book on the topic, 12 skills. The first one is for individual leaders. The second one is for teams, and I'll tell you why. And then we'll go into our topic for today, setting focus objectives, really important on teams so that you don't get off track. We've got some action items for you to think about, and then I'll give a little bit of a recap about what we're doing here in the School of Professional Studies, as we affectionately call SPS, and also the MOL, which is the Master of Organizational Leadership. So I'll recap those as well. And Gabby, jump in here if you have anything at any point in time. So we have been doing lessons in leadership for, oh gosh, quite a few years, I think now, Gabby. We do them in a whole variety of topics. This one falls into our core leadership skills. But you'll see on the right-hand panel, you see the page at Brown's SPS site. Just you can join there, or you can sign up there. You can come there. You'll see there's a whole listing of events that we've done, events that are coming. You can go to the YouTube channel that we have for past recordings. About an hour each, all kinds of interesting topics to help you be more effective in the workplace. So we did establishing unified direction last time. You can see after that statistics, stories, and surprises. I did not teach that, but now we're talking about setting focus objectives. So lots of information free to you. And also lots of information on our program. So, Laura and my book, Laura is also now an adjunct faculty here at Brown. So, hi, Laura, if you're on. We are putting together this book. We're finishing it up. We're putting in some case studies now from some of our client experiences. This should be out in the fall. So don't go to, I went to Amazon, I put in 12 skills to see what the ranking of our other book was, and 12 skills for teams comes up. You will not find it. I promise you, not yet. So we are not finished with it. So it's a work in progress. So any feedback you have, we're always happy to talk about. So you see on the right-hand side is kind of, I call it the dartboard because it looks like a dartboard. And it's really a recapitulation of the same structure that we had for our individual skills. The first book, we call it affectionately the Green Book. But what we found in organizations, Laura's my work, we worked in executive education and teaching adults like yourself in a lot of different forms for a lot of different times in high potential programs and also leader development programs within Brown at Harvard. And what we found was the same kind of skills came up over and over. So we did some secondary research and some based on our experience. And what we found, we hadn't looked at this and didn't conceive this going in, but that's the value of doing research, is we found that there's these six what we call areas. So leaders and teams also need to think about strategy and results, and they're sort of attention, right? You set a strategy, get results, and you see the skills in the sort of slices in the middle. You have to develop talent to have a good team. And then you need to have communication if you're going to drive change effectively. So within there, we see bespoke skills that are unique to what teams need to do. Now, the argument that we make in this book, which is similar to the one we made in the first book, is that everybody on a team is responsible for the team's success, not just the team leader. So if you've been on a bad team, which is like 100% of people, you have some responsibility to do what you can. Now, sometimes you can't do a lot, but to do what you can to try and enhance your team's performance. And that's a complex topic. I'll be fair. It's not one or two quick fixes. But ideally, as you go through your career, we want to give you the skills. That's the whole premise of the 12 skills program, is to help you build the leadership skills you need to be successful both individually and on teams. So you see on the left-hand panel there, these are the slices, if you will, on the dartboard, but it does start with a good team assessment. Last time we were here, we talked about setting clear direction, having a sense of vision, work breakdown structure. Today, we're going to talk about setting focus objectives. But on teams, there's conflict, which isn't a bad thing. There is bad conflict, and no conflict is typically not good. But conflict is something that we have to think about how we manage that effectively for productivity and innovation purposes. We want to make sure that we have good information sharing. We're not oversharing, but we're not also have a paucity of information so the team can't do its work. On teams, a lot of development happens. The team leader can coach people on the teams, and team colleagues can coach one another. So it's an opportunity for you to build your skills both as a coach and a coachee in the context of teams. Commitment matters a lot. People aren't committed to the team, you won't get the performance. Part of being committed is having accountability. And that's a challenging topic. We actually found some interesting people who have a concept called conscious accountability we're talking about here and bringing into the school. So it's there's a lot of different ways to think about accountability, but it's one of the most important things you can do. So personally and professionally on teams. The dynamics of a team, how the team evolves. Most of us are familiar with the Tuckman model, the form, storm, norm, perform, adjourn. But we see other models out there, and there's more research today that's incorporated in the book and what makes a great team. But one of those things is attending to the team as almost a living organism. Putting a bunch of people together and saying, I deputize you as a team, it doesn't work. You have to manage your team. And that's all the way up to top teams. Top teams are teams too, and they need to be managed like a regular team. Capturing learnings on teams, having an after action report, key learnings across the organization and what's working, having an agile team, meaning you're able to move quickly, change direction as new information, new obligations, new requirements come aboard. And then a sense of discipline, right? Have a set of routines and disciplines to enable your team to work effectively. And then ultimately, we want to recognize performance. But it all starts around a good team assessment, which you will find in the book at some point. So that's the gist for 12 skills for teams. So what we're going to do today is talk about setting focus objectives. Remember, you're using the dartboard as a bit of a life cycle. Most teams that you're on probably aren't just starting out. So you're somewhere in the life cycle. But so there's kind of a look ahead, look back. You can always go back and ask yourself, did we do these things? And if we didn't do these things, which a lot of teams don't always do, you can try to do those things. So it's very application oriented. So we're going to give you some of the best practices summary of what objective setting looks like in general. We're going to look at it from the standpoint of OKRs, which most people are familiar with, or at least have heard the title. I think I am in presentation mode. It is for me. Can people not see that? Someone put in the chat, can it be in presentation mode? I thought I was. I'll do it again. Let me double check here. Yeah, if you have feedback, let me know. Can you see? I can see my screen. Can you see it, Gabby?
See it, and it sounds like there's many that can. So
Okay.
yeah.
All right. All right. Could be something on your end. Okay. So thanks, Abdul. So we want to give you a quick summary of best practices on objective setting. This is not new. A lot of the stuff in the book isn't new. We wouldn't say that. It's curated from a lot of different sources. But the idea is we want to make sure that you have a chance to sort of understand and think about what some of the things are that work. We'll talk about OKRs, sort of the term of art these days, objectives and key result areas. My colleague Laura and I were brought up in the balanced scorecard world, and people will say, well, the balanced scorecard is old news. People don't use that anymore. The irony is OKRs are actually much older than objectives that came out of strategy work with that we did. We have our core process. Each of the chapters in all both of the books have a standard process you can follow. And you can understand how we're going to go through a little activity. We can think about how to set OKRs to help achieve your goals. So let's get going. So first, a test, a quiz. I want you to answer these questions on the screen. 0 is not at all. 3 is very much. And then go ahead and put this in the chat. I have it up. I'm multitasking here, which I'm not particularly good at, but I'll give it a go. Ask yourself, think about a team that you're on and your team's objective setting skills around the objectives we have. Does your team understand the context and linking what you're doing back to your vision? Do you have at a high level for your team 1 to 3 things that are really critical? And then do you have sort of maybe 3 to 4 key result areas that you're working on relative to those? And are you focused on a set of routines and processes to drive progress? And do you have periodic reviews? So I'm looking in the chat. Give yourself an overall rating and then think about, is there one area maybe where your team could be a lot better? And you see the scoring at the bottom. If you're below a 7 or below, there's plenty of room to improve. I would expect most people to be in that kind of 8 to 11 category. If you're in 12 to 15, great. So please give yourself a rating and drop it in the chat. We'd love to see how people are assessing their own team's performance or one of their team's performance these days. Thanks, Ian. 13, nice job, Katie. That's good. I think there's more than 2 people on the call, so it'd be great to see. Yeah, and it's dynamic. You might be in right now, and it's interesting. Thanks, Jennifer, Sam, appreciate it. One, plenty of room for improvement. Let's look at it that way. Jason. So what's interesting about this, please keep them coming. You see the wide distribution of team effectiveness. Thanks for the correction. Appreciate it, Adriana. So there are teams that are very, very good, and there are teams that are okay, and there are teams that are not doing that well. But again, remember it's dynamic in nature. I think 8 was kind of what I was expecting, that 8, 9-ish, so that's fine. Yeah, yeah, maybe they could make swap some team players out here. But remember, teams are dynamic, right? There's always a chance to improve the performance of your team. And you don't want to be that person that says, and I'll be honest, I've been in this role. I'm not going to say I wasn't. Like, this team's terrible. I'm not motivated to come to the meetings. We want to get out of that mindset and say, given my role, is there any way I can influence or help my team perform better? Well, there you go. You say all health is great. Wonderful. So now you know. So thanks for sharing. I love the feedback in the chat. Keep it coming. So it helps us make it kind of bespoke to you. So these are the things that we think about in the process that we came up with. Again, our process was we tend to look at HBR, but we also look at literature that translatable and germane. But I'm gonna go back in the Wayback Machine here for a minute and give you a little context. So people intermingle the term goals and objectives often. And my bias is to use objectives. And objectives are specific elements of the team's overall vision that we're trying to accomplish. Goals can get confused or conflated with targets, which is a specific level of performance. Where the objective says what we want to accomplish, what you'll see is the key result areas will oftentimes, in fact, do give us the quantification and the gauge of performance relative to the objective overall. So why do focused objectives matter? Okay, so we want to make sure that we're focusing our time and energy on the most important things. There was a book that came out years ago. I think it was the guy, I can't remember his name, Gary something. He started the one of the real estate companies, and it was called the one. I think it was the one big thing or the one thing. Very good book. And it was basically saying, look, find your one most important thing and break it down. That's how you get it done. The logics is still the same here. Usually teams don't just have one thing. There's a focus set of things that they need to accomplish to get to their overall outcomes. So why does this matter? Indiscriminately set objectives, they don't work together. Okay, you end up peanut buttering your time and energy and your team's limited resources, both attention, capacity, could be financial or technology resources, across a broader set of objectives, which makes it very hard to get traction. So you know that when you focus on something, you're able to typically get it done. So you want to have that conversation, understanding, I'm going to keep going up to what our vision and overall mandate is, and then linking that to a handful of objectives. If you can, narrow that set down to something that's very concentrated in terms of what you want to get for an outcome. It's important. Otherwise, you're going to end up spending a lot of time doing a lot of things, and you're going to feel like, we're just not making any progress or the kind of progress we need. So a lot of this is predicated on the team having a set of ongoing dialogue and conversation around what's working and what can be adapted. Now, let's think about this a little bit further. Ask yourself, think about a team that you are on or you're aware of where they had a really sort of tight set of objectives, that 1 to 3 kind of key objectives. And then ask yourself if maybe you're on this team or you know of this team, what did the team leader or the people on the team do to get to that level of, I would say, focus? And you can go ahead and put that in the chat. So what are the things that make for teams that are great at setting focus objectives? I'm hoping that someone was on a team that actually did this well. That's always another question as to whether or not you've been in a team that's done this well. What are some of the team experiences you had where you've seen a team do this? Love to see your thoughts in the chat. I won't ask to gauge any teams that we work on, Gabby. That wouldn't be fair to do. No one has any answers to this.
Yes,
Wow.
and don't tell Adriana that I might be curious about what's going on at UCLA Health.
No, we're not losing you. Have an overall strategy. Thank you, Richard. Yeah, this is really important, this collaborative process, understanding what the overall objectives or mandates are for the team. Why what we're doing is important. The big why, right? Simon Sinek. Alignment, everyone agreeing? Yeah. So communication, you're going to see that anchor, you're going to see that throughout. Communication is important. I would expect that we wouldn't get a ton of responses here because this isn't always something clear, concise, and measurable, proactive on like Marcus's point about what we're trying to accomplish. I would say most teams have an opportunity to tighten or focus their objectives. So if you're a team, yeah, if you create to Paolo's point, I'm sorry, to Amina's point about creating that safe environment, people are more inclined to say, is this realistic? Can we do this? So you're seeing all these elements kind of spilling through, trickling through around what's important to ultimately build an effective set of objectives for your team. Now, the process that we use is, oops, too fast. The process that we use is called the core process. So you want to get your core objectives down for your team. So the first thing is context. Confirm what it is you're trying to accomplish relative to your overall vision with your team, and then use that as a stepping stone to ensure that you're understanding how your objectives fit into context. I've got another slide a little later that will help with that. So understand and be sensitive to the context. Yep. Communication is clearly important, right? Then you're going to actually set your objectives. You're going to set that 1 to 3 tight, meaningful, challenging, inspiring. There's the old BHAG type of objectives. I'm not necessarily talking about that, but they need to be challenging and related to what you're trying to accomplish. Then you'll create your results areas. And we're going to have an activity where you get to do that on your own here to define 3 to 4 specific, measurable, time-bound key result areas that drive the objective. So OKRs were developed by Intel. Andy Grove back in the 70s. Many of you are probably familiar with that, but just as an FYI. Then you want to focus on the routines and the practices that drive those. Remember, we said one of the 12 skills is discipline. So this is where that discipline comes through, having the discipline to meet regularly, review performance regularly, and then ultimately some type of periodic review that's really an evaluation that says, okay, how are we doing? We're down in the weeds day to day, but can we come up and get a sense of how we're doing on our OKRs? Now, some people call them KPIs or measures or whatever you use, but the point here is 3 overall objectives. Break those down into your result areas, and then break those down into a mechanism to improve those over time through execution. Now, where does all this stuff come from? I think it's pretty important to note. So I made that note about goal setting theory. I made that note about OKRs in the 1970s, because you'll see in the late 60s, a theory came out from these 2 gentlemen named Locke and Latham that's called goal setting theory. So if any of you have heard of, which would be most everybody, SMART goals, that's right. Denise, you're a little bit ahead of me. This is what comes out of goal setting theory. So the theory says In order for goals to be effective, and I'm using goals in this point interchangeably with objectives, in order for them, anything that you're focused on accomplishing, it needs to be challenging. It needs to be combined with feedback. It will lead to higher performance than easy goals or vague goals. So goal setting or objective setting is critical into driving performance. Okay. And it is, if you've heard the SMART, and there's variations on this, but your objectives should be specific. They should be ultimately measurable. That's where we get to the result areas. They should be achievable, not a layup, so to speak, using basketball parlance, but they should be challenging. They should be relevant, and they should also be time bound, right? There's a law out there, work fills the time allotted to it. Many of you have heard that. I think it's called Parkinson's law. But the idea here is we want to make those objectives and then the corresponding result areas, meet the criteria of goal setting theory. So the researchers found that when goals or objectives were crafted in this manner, higher performance resulted. That's the backdrop for all of this, so you know where it comes from. So the mechanisms that drive goal achievement you see down in the bottom left. It's direction, clarity on what needs to be done that are relevant, right? You see those going back to the SMART acronym there. It's persistent. There has to be sustained effort over time. You have to make sure that you push hard against those most critical objectives, right? Back to the one main thing or the one big thing. The more energy you put on, a narrower set of goals, the increase the likelihood of accomplishing that. That shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. And then goals get you to think about what's the strategy for achieving them. That's where we get into the key result areas. So it takes commitment and it takes feedback. And those are mechanisms that we have built into the core process. So, but just so you know where all this comes from. Yeah, Dan, I hear the measure and motivational. I'm a bit of a traditionalist. I think a good measure, when done properly, is motivating. But I think I have a very strong bias, and feel free to criticize me for this, and I encourage my students to do so. The reality is leaders get paid on teams and individually to get results. And the way we know if people got results is we need to measure them. Doesn't mean we need to demotivate people or treat them poorly in the process. Goes back to this concept of psychological safety. That's important. But you can have challenging goals and you can encourage people and give them the tools and kind of push them a little bit. It's usually a push-pull. We talk about that in the book. It's not one or the other. If you want to call it motivating instead of measuring, that's fine. But ultimately, I think what we need to be clear is that I need, at the end of the year, when I sit down with the dean of the school and she asks me how I did, I don't say, well, my measures weren't very motivating, so I didn't hit that. I mean, she's going to ask, like, did you teach this? What were your evaluations? Did you get your next class out? Those kind of things. I leave that to you, smart people, to decide on your own. All right, so let's get the process started with the context confirmation. You always have to go back to why are we doing what we're doing? Someone put that in the chat. The why matters a lot. The mission, the purpose, the intent behind our team, whatever you want to call it. Why are we doing the things that we're doing? Without clarity on requirements, it's hard to know if we're going to get the right outcomes, and we have to gauge our performance accordingly. So the why just is and again, this is a great, I think several of you put this in the chat, which makes me, it warms my heart to see that, is we want to have a conversation. Are we working on the right high level vision and the high level expectations for our team? Really important, right? If you're not focused on that, it's going to be very hard to set objectives that are linked to that. So the idea is we want to confirm, yes, this is what we're doing. And ask yourself, have you ever been in a situation individually or on a team where you're working on something, you kind of pull your head up and then you say, oh, wait a minute, I'm not sure that's actually aligned to what it is we're trying to do here. That happens from time to time. But the way to avoid that is to always be toggling back and forth and confirming what the context looks like and that the work you're doing is still related to the overall mandate of your team. Because we know that teams' mandates change constantly throughout. That's very common in teamwork. Sometimes there's a concept called punctuation, where halfway through the team's life cycle, there's a recalibration of what the team's mandates or expectations are. So continuing on. So once we've had a chance to set the context, right? The idea is we want to make sure we can start thinking about developing objectives. Again, 1 to 3 relevant objectives that we want to accomplish for our team. Again, have a conversation. So these are the highest level things the team needs to accomplish, right? These are the things that sometimes we call them the glass balls. You can't drop these. We have to do these things and pay attention to them. The team leader will typically start the process. We're not decoupling the team from the team leader, but it's clearly a collaborative process built around conversation. The things that we want to work on and understand are critical. Now, this came from a piece of Harvard Business School, so I don't want to take credit for these 8 questions to ask. I'm going to put that in the slides. But the question here is ways to look and kind of interrogate your objectives are on the right-hand side. Ask your team, and you can do this now with objectives that you have for the teams that you're on currently. Is this meaningful or impactful? Is it going to get us to our overall vision or mandate? Are these objectives the top priority for our organization? Are the things we absolutely must do? Is it clear on what needs to be done with the objective? Usually it's a verb, noun kind of outcome associated with it. Would the objective challenge the team? Would it push the team to really raise their performance level? People want that at work, actually. They want to work diligently to the top of their capabilities, and oftentimes we don't challenge people to that. So we want to think about how to do that. Is there an element, it goes back to the question that was put in the chat earlier, is there some inspirational or motivational element? Does it get us excited to do this or as much as we can be for the nature of the work that we have day to day? Is it crisp? Is it easy to remember? Is it concise? Long-winded objectives are very confusing for people. I've spent many, many, many meetings helping people winnow down their objectives to, a very clear set of I would say outcomes that we want. And is there a sense of empowerment that the team feels like they can actually work on these things and accomplish these things? So again, you can use this list today or whenever you want with your team. Just ask, back to that conversation. Let's take a look at our top objectives. Are they linked back to what our mandate is? Has that changed at all? And let's give ourselves kind of a critique on these 8 tests, if you will, or questions for the objectives that we are working on. If you've got 10 or 15 objectives, ask the question, are these too many? Do we need to sequence them in some way? And maybe you can't do that. I understand that. Teams don't always get the luxury of picking exactly what they want to do and how they want to do it. But if you can refine this process at all, it should make your life a lot easier. Okay, so we've set the context. We've looked at developing our high level objectives, 1 to 3 of those, but some things to keep in mind as we do that. Remember, we've got the tests on the left-hand side of a good objective, impactful, priority, clear direction, those kinds of things. But the one thing I would say is really, really think about this. Less is more. Less is more in business and in life. You want to do fewer things better than more things halfway. So you want to focus in this case, learning matters. I don't want to discourage, say it's not learning, but OKRs are intended to drive performance. They're very specifically focused on getting things done over the shorter term. You can learn in an after action review, and we have literature on that we use. And it isn't that you don't learn, because learning is something that's part of one of the 12 skills for teams. But in this context, we want to make sure that we are driving what we want to have be accomplished with the development of really a crisp set of OKRs. And you see Charles's point and how his organization does it relative to that. Thank you for sharing. Now, some other things to think about when you start creating your results areas, and we're going to give you a little activity to do here. These are the specific measurable steps, right? Going back to the SMART around Locke and Latham's goal setting theory. So what is a KRA? And you've heard that before. It's a specific tactical milestone that clarifies how we're going to accomplish each of the objectives. So you usually come up with, you're kind of decomposing the objectives into these key result areas, right? So you're saying, again, you can use that sort of smart logic in the back, but the idea here is we want to figure out what's going to drive these objectives toward achievement. So you can think 8 and 9. It's not like 6 and 7, which I guess we're not supposed to say anymore. I don't know why that is, but we'll just use 8 and 9. So 9 tests for a good key result area. So again, I would encourage you to go back when you start looking, if you use KRAs or key result areas or measures of KPIs of any type, ask yourself, is this something the team can deliver on right away? Can you track progress with this indicator? Does it give you a sense of the team is on or off track relative to the overall objective achievement? Will it tell us if the team is making progress ultimately? Is it focused in scope? Is it quantifiable, typically in some way, shape, or form? Does it give us some success criteria that are clearly defined? Do we know what good looks like? Is it specific and time bound? Remember last part of our SMART acronym. Is it realistic? The thing we want to keep in mind is can we actually get useful data? The point Dan has here, let's see, during the objective goal setting process, say like in Q1, what are your thoughts on the levels? Yeah, I'm going to get to that. Hold that thought, Dan. I'm gonna show you how to think about that because it's a really important question. One of the things some of you have probably heard of a guy named Peter Drucker as kind of the father, so to speak, of management thinking. He was German, lived for many years, right up I think into the 90s, maybe in the 2000s, but very influential. He came up with a concept that some of you have probably heard called management by objective, MBOs. And this is essentially what that is. You hear SMART and MBOs and all these kinds of things. They're all sort of variations on the themes. One of the things that we found in practice doesn't work, and it gets to Dan's point, is when objectives are disconnected, meaning they're not nested or they don't fit in an overall architecture or cascading scheme, you have progress, but in a decentralized, decoupled way, right? So you don't want to make improvement in one part of the organization that doesn't link to or drive performance that's the organization is trying to accomplish overall. So we have to ask ourselves from the highest level objectives on our team, and we cascade down through key result areas. Do we do the same thing through the company or the organization? And the answer is yes. Because if you don't, you won't get an integrated set of products. To anchors, if you have a department that aligns all these, that's their job, right? And I've seen literature years ago on chief measurement officers, things like that. However you do it, you need to make sure that these are all integrated because if they're not, then you have, I would say, incomplete or impartial progress toward the overarching goals. You end up with what I call a diffusion of effort. So it ends up not being particularly effective. Again, I'd encourage you to go back and use these tests on the things that you're working on today. So let's think about an example of an OKR. And this will flow a little bit from some of the things we taught previously. So here's the result area. It's 10 additional influencer per week share if we're trying to drive awareness. So the purpose is to drive achievement of the objective, right? So this is a very specific you see, it's time bound, it's very specific. We can measure that, right? We just quantification. But the overall objective that we're linking this particular key result area back to is growing new customers by 30%. This is for site traffic, right? So the idea is you can see you would have multiple key result areas driving progress toward the objective. The idea is we've got data, we can see whether or not we're growing our new customers' presence. We say in order to do that, or rather the number of new customers or the number of net new customers we have in some cases is to grow from 380 to 500 over the course of our monthly trajectory. So the idea here is we are linking our key result areas back to the objectives that we have in the organization. Now, getting a little bit further, to give you an example, if you're not familiar with this, I thought it would be useful, and I want to be clear, I didn't take this from an organization called On Strategy. They do a lot of presentation on some of these fundamentals, which is great. So your objective here, we want to improve sales performance across the whole team. Now, I would probably time bound that and say, when do we, to what level and make it more specific. But they've done some of that in their key result areas below. So the first one is maintain a sales pipeline of qualified leads valued at 500K quarterly. So you've got the quantification, the specificity, and the time bound, right? Another key result area is a close rate from 22 to 27%. Another key result area is increase scheduling calls from 3 to 6 per week. Another key result area is grow average deal size from 10K to 12K in this illustration. So you can see here, we've got an overall objective, and then, that 1 to 3, and then the kind of 3 to 4 key result areas you see an illustration of that. And they're very clear, they're very focused, they're very specific, they're very time bound. And this is I would say, there's a good book out there by John Doerr. He was a venture capitalist. He worked actually years ago with Andy Grove before he started. I think it was at Kleiner, Perkins, Caulfield, and Byers on the West Coast. He's got a very popular book on key result areas. It kind of repopularized it after a few years. It's a very useful tool. One of the things that I think I have found over the years is not all things are created equal, right? And so Ed, what do you mean by that? One of the things we just need to be cautious about when we set key result areas is asking ourselves, which of these key result areas has the highest likelihood of driving the outcome we want? Usually it's not just one, but sometimes they are disproportionately impactful. And what I mean by that is using this illustration as an example notionally, it could be the case in this example that the second key result area increasing the close rate from 22 to 27% could have the most significant impact on the sales performance. Does that make sense? So when we set key result areas, we have to be careful not to use the spaghetti at the wall approach, which is let's come up with a bunch of these. There's probably a good one in there. We'll figure it out as we go. And that's sort of true. But what I'm saying is a better approach, because I've done this with teams, is to let's ask ourselves, and it gets into this concept called MISI, mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive, the consulting methodology, which is what do we think are all the things that could cause sales performance to be enhanced? Let's identify what those drivers are in this area. In this case, we're calling them key result areas. And then let's make sure we're clear on which ones we think have the most increased likelihood of success. Because again, on a team that has a limited amount of time and energy, you just want to make sure you're putting, as one of my colleagues said, the most of the wood that you have behind the arrow that you've selected. So again, there's nothing wrong with the 3 to 5 result areas. They can be allocated different parts of your team. That's fine. But try to be clear and have at least a hypothesis in mind around which of the key result areas will more than likely drive the progress that you want. So I'm going to give you an activity. Why don't you think about for yourself? You could do it personally or you could do it for your team. Why don't you set an OKR, right? Just do it on your own. What's an objective that you would come up with? You can think about a team that you're on, or if you're getting on a new team, or just a personal goal. And then think about 3 key result areas that you would identify that would drive performance for your objective. So, become a confident public speaker by the end of Q3, deliver 3 presentations. These are just a notional example. 3 presentations, groups of 10 or more by Q2, receive confidence rating greater than 7 out of 10, complete one course by. Okay, so very clear. Now, again, back to my point, not all of these will necessarily have the greatest impact, but at least you're starting with a clean slate of what can be done. Anyone want to try to put their response in the chat? You're welcome to do that. I'm going to give you a minute to do this little activity on your own. And you can make it personal. It doesn't have to be for your team. Feel free to. If there's something you're trying to accomplish in your life, it works just as well there too. Gabby, did you want to do something for you want to accomplish in your life?
Hmm.
You don't have to do it real
I was
time.
just thinking, would it be ironic if I said I wanted to be a confident public speaker on a presentation or I'm presenting?
Is that true?
No, it's not. I was just
Okay.
trying to
Yes.
use that to fodder some thought.
This is why we do this. We want to fodder some thought here for people.
Yes, I was just in an HR sponsored leadership course, and this was one of the things that they had us do was come up with some actionable goals.
Yes, that's right, Dan.
Yeah.
So remember, the objective is what we're trying to accomplish, and you can almost say that key result there is or the how. Increase faculty engagement with our CTL by 20%. That's an objective, high level. So now the question is, John, what are the things that are going to cause? I always use the term cause because there's a cause and effect. What causality? What's going to cause the faculty engagement with the CLT to go up 20%? To get down on actionable jobs in hydraulics. So that would need to be, you want to give that maybe a little more precision in terms of what that means. Come out of the comfort zone. Okay. But again, what does that mean? So the trick with all of this is to make it go back to SMART, the quantifiable. Yes, what does it mean to come out of the comfort zone? What does that mean? So it goes back here. This is, you want to be able to quantify. In this case, it's a number of presentations or something along those lines. Launch an Airbnb location. Okay. Now, so then the question is, EAG 807. What are the things that you would need to do? Okay, you'd have to get approval potentially. I know that's a different person, but you'd have to get approval. That might be something, but that's kind of a binary activity. It's like a yes or a no. It's not necessarily a key result area in any presentations. Okay. It's a little harder than it looks if you're not used to doing this. It requires very structured thinking. So for those who do this for a living, it's like, oh, this is no big deal. If you're not familiar with this, it's a methodology that you want to spend some time with. All right. So I appreciate you playing along, those of you playing along at home. Give it a try. So a couple of other things. So remember, we've gone through the context setting, we've developed our objectives, we're working through the key result areas, and you can always refine these, right? Now, the question that Dan had earlier, if my memory serves me correctly, and these are also from our friends at On Point or On Strategy, the OKR structure is simplified. So you'll see they've said there's a company level strategic goals. I still at the company level, Laura and I always use objectives. There's company level objectives. Those go, their strategic objectives or strategic goals. They come cascade down into company-wide goals, and then these KRAs and individual result areas go down further, right? So you start at the strategy level, you go down to an annual cascade into company level objectives. Now it starts looking more like an operating plan, and then you get down to key results areas. Again, this is very consistent terminology. Make it action oriented. You can have a KPI or basically a metric. Someone champions that or follows up on it. On this case, we're down in the organization. We're using this on a team specific level. That being said, we know that it nests in an overall organizational hierarchy. And then it's just some term of art verb, individuals create them, quarterly result, etc. So again, to Charles's point, find three venues. So remember, the thing you want to keep in mind when you create these is be very clear. Long objectives are not good. Make them action oriented. That's why you see the verb nomenclature in there. Make them very precise in terms of the quantifiable. A metric is the quantification of the efficiency and effectiveness of an action. So we want to make sure that we use that to quantify the action we took. Did we find three venues? Maybe I have to look at 20 venues to get to the three, right? So you want to be very clear and list 10 students per class. We want to be very clear. This is going to drive some type of action. And remember, it's not trying to be funny here, but getting things done requires us to take, if we go back to, I have too many screens up. It takes, remember the mechanisms that drive direction, persistence, effort, and strategy, right? So, and then it's moderated or it's impacted by the level of commitment and the feedback we get. So it's all tied into our overall team's 12 skills architecture. But our job here is to really push on the direction, push on the persistence. So back to the example Charles has, like, well, if you've only looked at one venue, you haven't worked hard enough, right? I'm sure you look at many more than that. But the point here is, like, I want to be able as the manager and come back and not to grill Charles and say, how are we doing on three venues? Oh, I've looked at two this week. One's good. I got to look at. Okay. Do you need any help with that? No, I think, where have you looked? I've looked here. I mean, you see, you're having that performance conversation. And a lot of that, back to psychological safety, is how can I help you? Do you need something? Now, at some point in time, like if it's time bound, I'm going to say, hey, Charles, we're closing in on the end of Q3. Like, are we there? Well, we're almost there. Okay, can we maybe put a little more effort against it, or can I help you with something else? That's where the time binding, and also the clarity around effort come into play. And execution is, as I mentioned, it's pushing and pulling. That's what that conversation is about, right? Part of the conversation is giving direction. Try to look here for these venues. Try to check that, and there's deadlines that go along with it. Part of that conversation is also brainstorming. Well, what do you think could happen? How else do you think we could do this? The best leaders push and pull. It's not one or the other. It's not pushing hard all the time, or it's not kind of laying back and let everybody. I mean, your job as a leader is to get results, right? That's why we have key result areas. But your job is also to help your team. Sometimes you're pushing them. Hey, Charles, we're a little bit behind. What can we do to get ahead? Or earlier on in the process, hey, Charles, how's it going? Do you need any help? Have you looked over here? What do you think about that? And then that's that process that plays out. That's good, effective management. I had a performance conversation yesterday with someone. I was like, hey, you're behind on this thing. It's got to be done by the end of the month. What's going on? Oh, okay. Yeah, I got it. Can we just step that up? Do you need any help? No, I got it. Okay, great. And then I got a note today from someone else. Hey, that thing, we're back on track. Great. It was literally like a 2 minute conversation. No guilt, nobody's in trouble, nothing happened. We just need to get back on track. So habits and outcomes, back to this discipline and behaviors and routines. You as on a team, when you're a team member or team leader, the behaviors are going to drive the performance, right? The behaviors are going to cause the performance. The measures are great, the result areas are great, the metrics and all the quantifications, the objectives are great, but you have to have the sustained effort and the commitment and the feedback to get this done. So routines and rhythms matter a lot. Check-ins, I mean, it's important. Yeah, check-ins are important. And that routinization is what helps make teams effective. We're going to, the problem in some respects, it's a sort of a point of view, a personal point of view, is, we have lots of meetings in organizations. We don't have a lot of agendas, but we have a lot of meetings. And one of the most fundamental questions we should be asking before we do anything with other people is, do we really need to do this together? Do we need to have an hour to do this? Or could we have a 5 minute check-in and let people get back to work? We don't do that enough. Meetings are important. I wouldn't minimize that, but you want to have routines that work very quickly. As the academic director, I have about 6 or 7 faculty that I guess we'd say report to me. That's kind of official sounding. I don't really think that way, but that I check in with them every couple of weeks, and I give them about an hour. I schedule an hour, but I try to keep it to a half hour. But sometimes the conversation goes. I say, "Hey, here's how we're doing on performance. We're ahead of plan for the MOL. Here's the things that are happening. Here's what's going on. Here's the developments. Here's the things you need to know. Everybody go around what's on your mind. What are the things you need help with? Oh, I need you to get me on email. I need you. Oh, great. So, I mean, but the routine is, and I got this note from one of my other faculty. I'm so sorry I missed the meeting. I'm in Japan. I was like, why? Of course, I didn't expect you to be at the meeting. You're in Japan. But the point is, you want to have meetings that are useful, and having a rhythm and some clarity and a cadence is really helpful to that. Okay. So we want people who are top performers to spend their time doing the things they're good at, not sitting in meetings. Otherwise, we're going to get behind performance wise. Yeah, team leaders, teams, employees blow. If you blow through the objective, then ultimately you can recast or set the objective to Dan's point. So again, and frequent evaluation, keep it focused. Try to stay focused on Bill. Thanks for coming. You making sure that you're getting the performance you need, and you'll find the better you get at the check-ins, the faster the check-ins will go because people understand what's going to happen. They can report ahead of time. You become better at. Have a balanced approach with benchmarks and members who fine tune their focus and but always stay connected to that vision, where we're going overall, the long term. So again, collect performance data, ask what's happening, make sure you're driving progress. The method works. It's not new. I mean, there's nothing new in here really. We've learned a few things on how to make it work, but the key is making it work. So for you, and I'm just going to wrap up some action steps and just talk about the MOL a little bit for those that are interested. If you're not, just drop off. And thanks for coming. Test your team to see if you walk through that process, 1 to 3 objectives, 3 to 4 core or key result areas per. How's our execution look, our feedback, our stick-to-itiveness? Draft your OKRs. We did that little test here. Make sure you check in on the context. Don't get so far down in the trees you forget which forest you're in. Go back and ask. Make sure you have the rhythm and start the rhythm, even if it doesn't work. Just start it and keep with it. It will get better over time. The routinization will get better over time. If you ever tried to change your own behavior, it's inconsistent at first, then you forgot something, then you did it 3 times in a row, then you forgot. Just keep at it and the routine will come. And then play to your strengths. You got a team. Make sure that people work on the things that they're most capable of being effective in. So thanks for being here for this. Just a couple of bits on the School of Professional Studies. If you've heard this before, we'll see you at the next session. If not, you might find this useful. We got a lot of degrees and all kinds of programs for people that you can take advantage of. Short courses, AI courses. We got degree programs, as you see here. We got master's degrees across the entire university, not just in SBS, but we've got custom programs for organizations that we work on, and we've got non-credit bearing programs. So there's typically something for everybody, depending on what skills you need to build. So in really programs are in demand. There's a really interesting article, twofold, in the Wall Street Journal yesterday on the value of MBAs and how some MBAs are cutting their prices. It's very interesting. The world of higher education is getting disrupted, and how the number of A's students are getting, the percentage is going up thanks to ChatGPT and Claude. So it's getting harder for us to give grades. But the point of the story is there's a lot of change happening, and we need to keep our skills sharp to change with those things. So the programs that we see that are really focused on leadership are the Masters of Organizational Leadership, the Masters of Management. Those are fully online asynchronous programs. So you can take those from anywhere in the world. We got people in Portugal and Ottawa. We got people all over the place. You can take those at I won't say at your leisure, but you can take them at a time that works for you because it's not always synchronous. We've got a hybrid MBA program, which is kicking off again here shortly. We've got a hybrid technology leadership, healthcare leadership, leader as coach, effective communications, all kinds of stuff for you to take advantage of. Now, in the MOL program that I'm responsible for, it's 100% online. It's a reasonable tuition for an Ivy League degree. It's 8 courses over 16 months. You can take them one at a time if you want. We will have an optional 2.5 day session next May. So we start our second cohort here in the fall. We've already achieved our targets. We're well past that. But there are weekly synchronous sessions. People always ask, do I actually get to meet the instructor? Yes, we talk to you live and all those things. We don't avoid you. But yeah, it's 4 consecutive semesters, and we do have scholarships up to 50% available for students who meet the criteria for that. So it's been successful. People seem to like it. I ask them that. We're always looking for feedback, but I think by and large, for an Ivy League degree program, I find it's valuable. So again, the value of this organizational leadership degree is it's very much like this. I teach in it as well. It's like it's real world stuff. We take the theory, you saw Locke and Latham, we apply it to the concepts, we give you tools, and we want you to be effective with that. It's got a flexible online format. We have amazing faculty, handpicked from Harvard, Brown, Columbia. They're amazing folks. And it's not just faculty from SBS. We also incorporate our faculty from the university. So we've got a wide network that we cast and bring in. A lot of diverse career paths. We get a lot of people from military, HR, coaching, things like that. And now we're bringing out tracks. We have a new education track for people who are in education from K up to university level. So take a look if it's of interest to you. I think you'll find it's valuable. Thanks very much for being here today, Gabby. Anything for you?
I'm just going to add in, I'm going to throw in the chat a couple of links. If you are interested in learning more about any of our programs, I can send over, I'll pop some links in the chat, as well as an email address that you can reach out to us at any time with any questions. And
Yeah, so please do. And if you have, you can reach me on LinkedIn, or you can reach me on my email, Edward_Barrows@brown.edu. Hope to hear from you. Thanks, everybody.
we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A in a few minutes,
Oh,
Ed.
well, I'm here for those.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, you're still here. Perfect. And perhaps some of these you might have answered because they were pretty early on, but it never hurts to repeat. So, how to keep a solid direction when it comes to changes that will affect our day to day? Should you modify the compass?
Well, it depends on what the changes are. So it would be hard to say yes or no. It depends on the nature of the change, sort of the direction, the magnitude, those kinds of things. I think the analogy I use a lot is sailing. If you're on track and the wind's the same and the waves are the same and nobody's about to smash into you, you probably keep on the tack that you're on. If some conditions are changing, you see a storm coming, or one of the sails rips, then you're probably going to have to start making some course corrections. So you're always attuned to those things, but you want to make sure you don't make any major course corrections unless you absolutely have to. So hopefully that sort of puts it. So it's sort of awareness, mindfulness in terms of what's happening, but not necessarily change unless it's really necessitated.
All right. So this one is more about how do we influence leadership? So if you're putting in the effort, having the ideas, innovating, and you feel like leadership is maybe not listening, um, how do we cope with that?
Well, leadership always listens. That's a fact. But ultimately, so I mean, in all fairness to senior leaders, they got a lot on their plate. It's a complex job. You've got, if you look at primary and secondary stakeholder groups, you're trying to juggle a lot of things if you're a senior leader. So a lot of times in the organization, you feel like they're never listening, they don't care. It's pretty hard to do that job. Now, that being said, in the first book, we have a chapter on influence and persuasion, and there's very specific techniques you can use to persuade people. It's ethos, pathos, logos. It's your own credibility. It's being involved in getting to know people. It's about building relationships with people so you can influence them in a positive, ethical way, letting people know your ideas, finding people who are opinion leaders to share your ideas. It, Coming from the military, I tell people the frontal assault approach does not always work. Like just telling someone and telling someone and telling someone. It's kind of like if you it's kind of like if you ever had somebody, I hear people say this, like, I've told that person 23 times that, but when you told them, then they did it, right? It's like that. It's that whole thing. So you have to try to figure out how to get your ideas across. And sometimes that takes some persuading and some influencing that's not direct. So there's very specific tools that help with that. They don't always work, but by and large, thinking about who has power in an organization, who has influence, partnering with them, building your own credibility through voluntary actions and things like that will oftentimes get you in a position where your ideas are more likely to be heard. If it's a bad idea, it may not be heard. But if it's a competing idea with someone else, you'll have to get some airtime with some credibility.
And a couple questions about some of our leadership programs. And so they're specifically wondering whether the org leadership or organizational leadership or the education leadership track would prepare someone to be able to teach in the higher education space.
No, it's not. It's not intended for that. It's not not to the best of my knowledge. I don't run that program per se. Esther does, but it's not a teaching qualification. I don't think that's true. We'll have to double check on that. But I think it's for people who are working in the industry that want to advance in the industry. It wouldn't help you become a certified teacher or something like that. You'd want to look at a program that's bespoke around getting a teaching qualification.
Yes. And then somebody also asked about certificates in leadership, right? So we have a number of our certificate programs here at SPS. And how does that help somebody maybe further their career? Do you see
Yeah,
that?
it's
Yeah.
a great question. I mean, I think the books that we've written and the programs that we have here are really focused on helping people advance in their careers. It was funny, I was talking to our dean yesterday, and she's got a new sort of vision, which I think is great. She said, really what we do at SPS is we take kind of the knowledge and the research and the sort of tradition of the university, right? And the disciplines that the university is known for, economics, psychological sciences, cognitive sciences, and we map it to the people who are in the professional workplace and make it relevant to them. So the point here is leadership is a craft. It's an applied, I won't say art, but it's an applied activity. But we know a lot more about leadership than we did, we meaning the academy and managers, than we did 50 years ago. So what you get out of the programs is learning what works in organizations, right? Learning how to navigate organizations, learning how to build relationships, learning how to give feedback, learning how to set direction. In the world we live in today, people don't always get those skills or training. They just kind of get promoted, and you get promoted usually based on a technical aspect of your work, but not a relational aspect necessarily, or working well with people. So these kinds of programs, whether they be certificates or degrees, help you build those skills that enable you to become more effective in knowing what the tools and techniques are. To Adriana's point, we don't have any doctoral programs at this point. Sorry about that. But maybe that'll be on the horizon. Most of the doctoral programs, I think almost all of them are up the hill, so to speak, at the university. But there's a lot of online leadership programs and in-person leadership programs that do provide doctoral training. And sometimes those are also in the educational doctorate space too. Any other questions?
Just reading. They're just trying to figure out different
Well,
career.
I missed that question on the track. Sorry about that. I saw somebody.
Yeah, they're trying to
Uh,
figure out different sort of
it's probably
career.
just, I would say, Denise, it's probably the track that's most useful is just the main track. We don't have a nonprofit track yet, but I would say the generic leadership track. We have people in there from the military, from nonprofits, from healthcare, from coaching, from attorneys, accountants. It's a great wide range of people with a lot of different skills that I think makes it special. And nonprofits fit in there just as well as anyone else.
And I'm going to just further that the leadership track overlaps with the majority of the courses in terms of as well as the mole track or the traditional track. But there is just some really specific courses looking at educational systems, educational leadership, policy, how to transform education. So I think of the individuals who would be attracted to that being people who want to be leaders within the educational space, right? Maybe you are an administrator, maybe you're in the school department, superintendent, things like that, versus, and that could be obviously from pre-K all the way through higher ed,
Yep.
but you're kind of at that top level. All
All
right.
right.
I think we have done it, Ed, and we are 1 minute to spare. So,
All right. Well, thanks everybody if you're still here. Gabby, thank you.
of course, have a great rest of your day.
Take care. Bye.
Bye bye.